The handcuffs were cold, but not as cold as the eyes staring back at him from the gallery. 42 people sat behind him, and not one of them believed he was innocent. He had 11 rupees in his pocket, a torn shirt on his back, and no lawyer standing beside him. In 11 minutes, a stranger in a black robe would decide whether he lived free or died in a cell. And then, just as the gavel rose, a voice cracked through the silence of the courtroom. "Don't you remember me?" Ranveer Thakur was born in a village so small that it didn't have its own name on most maps. People simply called it the place past the canal. His father died when he was 6, crushed under a collapsed wall at a construction site he'd been working on for less than a month. His mother, Kaushalya, took in sewing work and washed clothes for 3 houses in the neighboring town to keep him and his younger sister, Bhavna, fed. By the time Ranveer was 10, he was already carrying bricks on his head at construction sites after school, earning 15 rupees a day. He never complained. He had learned early that complaining didn't fill stomachs, work did. There was one boy in his village school who was different from the rest. His name was Devendra Rai, the son of a retired schoolteacher who had saved every rupee to make sure his son studied law in the city. Devendra was quiet, bookish, and constantly bullied by the older boys for being thin and wearing glasses held together with tape. One afternoon, 3 boys cornered him behind the school's water tank, ready to beat him for the crime of scoring higher than them in a test. Ranveer, 13 years old, and already built like someone twice his age from years of manual labor, stepped between them. "Leave him," he said, just 2 words, but something about the way he said them made the 3 boys hesitate, then scatter. Devendra never forgot that moment. From that day, an unlikely friendship grew between the 2 boys, one who dreamed of arguing in courtrooms, and one who couldn't imagine a life beyond the next day's wages. They studied together under the light of a single kerosene lamp when Devendra's father allowed it. Ranveer never had enough time or money to properly study, but he listened to Devendra read aloud from his law books, fascinated by a world of justice that felt as far away from his village as the moon. One day, Devendra told him once, lying on the roof of his house looking at the stars, "I'm going to be a judge, and when I am, I'll make sure no poor man is ever wronged in front of me, not while I'm sitting there." Ranveer had laughed. "And what will I be, your peon?" "No," Devendra said seriously, "you'll be the reason I still believe good people exist." They were 15 when Devendra's father got a transfer to the city, and the 2 boys were separated. They promised to write letters. For the first 2 years, they did Devendra's letters full of city stories, exams, and dreams of law school. Ranveer's letters shorter, written in careful, effortful handwriting, describing his mother's health, his sister's schooling, and how much he missed their nights on the rooftop. Then the letters slowed. Then they stopped. Life pulled them into different rivers, and neither ever expected to see the other again. 22 years is a long time, long enough for boys to become strangers to their own childhood. Ranveer was 40 now, and life had not been gentle to him. His mother had passed away 12 years ago. His sister was married and lived 3 states away, and they spoke maybe twice a year. He had worked as a laborer, a driver, a security guard, and finally settled into running a small roadside dhaba, a food stall on the outskirts of the city of Nagpur, selling tea and simple meals to truck drivers and daily wage workers. It wasn't much, but it was his. He had a wife, Meera, a gentle woman who helped him manage the stall, and a 9-year-old son, Aryan, who was the reason Ranveer got up every single morning before sunrise. He didn't have money for private tuition, but he made sure Aryan went to the government school and did his homework every night, because Ranveer had promised himself long ago, "My son will have the education I never got." Life was hard, but it was steady, until the night everything fell apart. It was a Tuesday in October. Ranveer had just closed the dhaba, counting the day's earnings, barely enough to cover the week's grocery, when he heard shouting from the narrow lane behind his stall. He recognized the voice immediately. It was Suresh, a local moneylender who had been harassing a young widow named Kamla for weeks over a debt her late husband had taken. Ranveer had seen this before. Suresh was not a man who collected debts fairly. He was a man who used debts as an excuse to threaten, to intimidate, and worse. Ranveer had warned him once before to leave Kamla alone. That warning had made him an enemy. By the time Ranveer reached the lane, he found Kamla on the ground and Suresh standing over her, his hand raised. Without thinking, Ranveer grabbed Suresh's wrist and shoved him back. Suresh stumbled, cursed, and swore he would finish Ranveer for interfering. He left, spitting threats into the dark. Ranveer helped Kamla up, walked her home, and thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 2 nights later, Suresh was found dead behind the very same lane, his skull fractured, a heavy iron rod discarded a few feet from his body. And the last person seen arguing with him, the man with a public history of threatening him, the man whose fingerprints, through no coincidence at all, were later found on the rod, was Ranveer Thakur. He was arrested at 4 in the morning, dragged out of his home in front of his crying wife and terrified son, and thrown into a police lockup with no explanation beyond. You know what you did. He hadn't touched Suresh that night. He hadn't even left his house after closing the dhaba. But in a case where the accused is poor, has no political connections, and the victim's family has money and influence, the truth often doesn't matter as much as who's willing to fight for it. And there was the real story beneath the surface. Suresh's older brother, a local contractor named Baldev, had wanted that lane and the adjoining stretch of land for a warehouse project for over a year. The moneylending, the harassment of Kamla, all of it had been Baldev's slow scheme to force poor families out of the area to buy the land for cheap. Suresh's death, arranged by Baldev's own hired men after a dispute over money between the brothers, was a perfect opportunity. Frame the outspoken dhaba owner who had publicly humiliated Suresh days earlier, remove one more obstacle from the land, and walk away clean. Ranveer knew none of this. All he knew was that he was innocent, and no one believed him. Mira sold her wedding jewelry, the only thing of value they owned, to hire a lawyer. The lawyer took the money, made 2 court appearances, and then vanished, later claiming he had other commitments. He was, in truth, quietly paid off by Baldev's men to abandon the case. Ranveer's court-appointed legal aid lawyer, a tired, overworked young man managing over 60 cases at once, could barely remember Ranveer's name, let alone build a defense. He showed up to the first hearing 11 minutes late, without having read a single page of the file. Mira visited every lawyer she could find in Nagpur. Most refused outright. A case against a wealthy, influential family was not worth the risk to their reputation, not for a dhaba owner who couldn't pay. One lawyer laughed her out of his office. Another told her, not unkindly but bluntly, "Sister, this case isn't about truth. It's about who has more money and more fear on their side. Your husband has neither." By the time the trial date arrived, Ranveer had no legal representation left. The judge, a stern man named Justice Oberoi, this needed to be different, offered to appoint fresh legal aid, but the process would take another 2 months, and Ranveer, terrified of spending even more time in the overcrowded, violent jail cell where he'd already been beaten twice by inmates paid to teach him a lesson, told the court he would represent himself. "I have nothing to hide," he said, standing in chains before the packed courtroom. "I did not kill that man. I don't need a lawyer to tell the truth. I only need someone to listen." The gallery murmured with pity, some with mockery. The prosecution lawyer, a sharp, confident man named Yashpal Singh, hired generously by Baldev, smiled faintly. This would be easy. For 3 weeks, the trial unfolded like a slow execution. Yashpal Singh brought witness after witness, some genuinely mistaken, some paid to lie, all pointing toward Ranveer. The fingerprint evidence, later revealed to have been tampered with by a corrupt junior officer on Baldev's payroll, was presented as ironclad. Ranveer, untrained in law, fumbled through cross-examinations, unable to properly challenge the testimonies, unable to expose the holes that a trained lawyer would have torn open in minutes. Kamla, the widow he had saved, wanted to testify in his defense, but she was too afraid. Baldev's men had visited her home the night before the hearing and reminded her, without saying it directly, what happened to people who caused problems for the family. Every night, Ranveer sat in his cell, staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying his life. He thought of his son, who now flinched every time he heard a police siren. He thought of Mira, exhausted from working double shifts at the dhaba alone, aging years and weeks. He thought, sometimes in the quietest and most fragile moments, of an old friend from his childhood, a thin boy with taped glasses who once promised, on a rooftop under the stars, to make sure no poor man was ever wronged. He wondered, foolishly, what had become of Devendra, Whether he'd even become a lawyer at all. Whether he'd remember the boy who once stood between him and 3 bullies. It was a small, useless comfort. A memory, nothing more. Ranveer didn't even know if Devendra was alive. The final day of the trial arrived on a gray, humid morning in November. The courtroom in Nagpur District Court was fuller than usual. Word had spread of the poor man defending himself, and curious spectators, journalists hungry for a tragic story, and Baldev's smirking associates filled every bench. Ranveer stood in the dock, his wrists cuffed, his shirt, the only clean one he owned, hanging loosely on a frame that had lost considerable weight over the months of stress and poor jail food. Meera sat in the front row, gripping Aryan's hand so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Aryan, too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, only knew that his father looked smaller than he remembered, and that made him afraid. The presiding judge had not yet entered. There had been a last-minute change. The original judge assigned to the case had fallen seriously ill overnight, and a replacement was being brought in from the Sessions Court to avoid delaying the verdict any further. Adv. Yashpal Singh stood confidently, shuffling his papers, already rehearsing his closing argument in his head, a performance he expected to deliver flawlessly, sealing the fate of a man who could not defend himself. "All rise," the court clerk announced, the honorable judge presiding. The doors behind the bench opened. A tall man in his mid-40s walked in, his black robe crisp, his face composed with the practiced neutrality that years on the bench demand. He settled into his chair, adjusted his spectacles, and began reviewing the case file in front of him with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen 1,000 trials. His name, printed neatly on the nameplate before him, read, Justice Devendra Rai. Ranveer did not register the name at first. His mind was elsewhere, on Meera's face, on Aryan's small hand, on the 11 minutes the clerk had announced remained before the final arguments would conclude and a verdict would be handed down. He barely looked up. The judge reviewed the file for several long minutes in complete silence, the only sound in the courtroom the soft rustle of paper and the occasional cough from the gallery. Something about the file seemed to make him pause. He read the same page twice. His eyes moved to the name of the accused, Ranveer Thakur, son of the late Ram Thakur, resident of the village past the canal, District Nagpur. His pen stopped moving. He looked up slowly, and for the first time, actually looked at the man standing in the dock, not as the accused, a name and number on a file, but as a person. A man with tired eyes, a thin frame, a face lined with more suffering than his 40 years should have carried. The judge's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, from professional neutrality to something else. Something like recognition trying to surface through 2 decades of distance. Adv. Singh, the judge said, his voice steady but slower than before, please proceed with your closing arguments. Yashpal Singh rose eagerly, launching into a confident, polished speech about motive, opportunity, and the irrefutable fingerprint evidence. He painted Ranveer as a man with a violent temper, someone who had publicly assaulted the victim days before his murder, a man who had no alibi and no credible defense. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, his voice growing more theatrical with each passing sentence, clearly enjoying the moment, occasionally glancing toward Baldev, who sat smugly in the back row, arms crossed, already tasting victory. When Yashpal finished, the judge turned to Ranveer. Does the accused have anything to say in his defense before this court delivers its judgment? Ranveer swallowed hard. He had said everything he could over the past 3 weeks. He had no new arguments, no dramatic evidence to unveil, no lawyer's clever rhetoric. He only had the truth, worn thin from repetition, and a growing, hollow certainty that the truth alone was not going to be enough. Your Honor, he said, his voice cracking slightly, I've said it every day of this trial and I'll say it one final time. I did not kill Suresh. I stopped him from hurting a widow who couldn't defend herself. That's the only crime I'm guilty of, trying to protect someone weaker than me. I have no money for a lawyer, no witnesses brave enough to speak for me, no evidence except my word. I know that's not much in a court of law, but it's all I have. If this court decides to punish me anyway, I only ask, let someone take care of my son. He's only 9 years old, Your Honor. Please, let him grow up to see that being poor doesn't mean you have to be a criminal. Silence fell over the courtroom. Even the murmuring gallery had gone quiet, moved despite themselves by the awe simplicity of his words. Mira was crying softly. Arian pressed his face into his mother's arm. The judge sat still for a long moment, his pen resting on the file, his eyes fixed not on the papers but on Ranveer's face. Something in his memory, a rooftop, two boys under a sky full of stars, a promise made in the reckless confidence of youth, began pulling at the edges of his composed expression. The accused's full name, the judge said slowly, is Ranveer Thakur, son of the late Ram Thakur, from the village past the canal. Yes, Your Honor, the court clerk confirmed, checking the file. The judge removed his spectacles, set them down, and looked directly at the man in chains before him, really looked, past the years, past the exhaustion, past the prison uniform, searching for the 13-year-old boy who had once stepped between him and three bullies behind a water tank, who had said two words that changed the entire direction of his life. Leave him. Ranveer, the judge said, his voice barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the courtroom it carried to every corner. Don't you remember me? The entire courtroom froze. Yashpal Singh's confident posture faltered, his pen slipping slightly in his hand. Baldev in the back row sat forward, his smug expression suddenly replaced by unease. Mira looked up through her tears, confused. Arian lifted his head, sensing that something in the air had shifted. Ranveer stared at the judge, his mind scrambling to make sense of the question. It had been over 2 decades. He had aged, gray now streaking through his hair, lines etched deep into his face from years of hard labor and harder losses. But something in the judge's eyes, a certain steadiness, a certain gentleness beneath the authority, tugged at a memory buried so deep he hadn't visited it in years. I don't, Ranveer began then stopped, his breath caught. The judge stood up from his chair, an almost unheard-of act mid-session, and stepped down from the raised bench, walking slowly toward the dock. The court clerk half rose in protest at the breach of procedure, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him without a word. 22 years ago, the judge said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to keep professional, there was a thin boy with broken glasses held together by tape, who used to get beaten behind a water tank at the village school past the canal. 3 older boys used to corner him nearly every week. Until one day, a boy his own age, but built like someone twice his size from carrying bricks after school, stepped between them. He said only 2 words. Leave him. And they left. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Mira's hand flew to her mouth. That boy, the judge continued, his eyes glistening, used to sit with me every night under a kerosene lamp, listening to me read from law books he couldn't fully understand. But he listened anyway because he believed in something bigger than either of us understood back then. He told me once, lying on a rooftop, looking at the stars, that he'd never amount to more than a laborer. I told him he was wrong. I told him that one day, I was going to become a judge, and that I would make sure no poor man was ever wronged in front of me, not while I was sitting there. Ranveer's legs nearly gave out beneath him. The memory rushed back all at once, the rooftop, the stars, the kerosene lamp, the promise. Devendra, he whispered, his voice breaking entirely now. Devendra Rai. Yes, the judge said, tears finally slipping past his composed exterior, unashamed in front of the entire courtroom. It's me, Ranveer, I never forgot you. I looked for you for years after we lost touch, but I never had an address, never had a way to find you. I always wondered if you were even. He couldn't finish the sentence. The 2 men, one in chains, one in judicial robes, stood facing each other across an invisible line that no courtroom protocol had ever anticipated. For a moment, the years, the titles, the chains, and the robe disappeared, and they were simply 2 boys again, one who had protected the other from bullies, and one who had promised to protect the world from injustice. The courtroom buzzed with stunned whispers. Yashpal Singh, sensing the sudden and dangerous shift in momentum, rose quickly. Your Honor, with respect, this reunion, however moving, cannot influence the court's judgment. The evidence against the accused remains. I am aware of my duties, Advocate Singh, Justice Rai said, composing himself and returning to the bench, his voice regaining its judicial steadiness, though his eyes remained red. Do not mistake compassion for bias. If anything, this discovery demands that I examine this case with even greater scrutiny, precisely because I must ensure no one, including myself, mistakes personal history for proof of innocence. He sat back down, and for the first time since the trial began, N truly began reading the case file line by line, not as a formality, but as a man determined to uncover the truth. "I want the fingerprint report re-examined by an independent forensic lab," he announced. "I want the officer who filed the original fingerprint evidence to appear before this court for questioning. I want the phone records of the victim, Suresh, from the 72 hours preceding his death, submitted in full, not the partial excerpt provided by the prosecution. And I want to know," his eyes moved deliberately to Baldev sitting in the gallery, whose face had drained of all color, "why the victim's brother, Baldev, filed 3 separate land acquisition applications for the very lane where his brother's body was found, all within the 2 weeks before the murder." A stunned silence fell. Baldev shifted uncomfortably, whispering urgently to the man beside him. Yashpal Singh, sensing the ground crumbling beneath his case, attempted a weak objection. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular, reopening evidentiary examination at the closing stage of—" "What is irregular, Advocate Singh," Justice Rai said sharply, "is a fingerprint report filed by a junior officer with no supervising signature, submitted 11 days after the alleged discovery, in a case where the accused had no legal representation for the majority of his trial. I would rather delay a verdict by 2 weeks than deliver an unjust one in 2 minutes. This court will adjourn for further investigation." The gavel came down, not to seal Ranveer's fate, but to reopen the door to the truth. Over the following 2 weeks, under the direct oversight of Justice Rai, the case that had seemed so airtight began to fall apart at every seam. The independent forensic lab found that the fingerprint evidence had been improperly processed, inconsistent with proper chain of custody procedures, and upon deeper analysis, showed signs consistent with having been lifted from an unrelated surface and transferred, a crude but effective method of fabrication when done by someone with access to police resources. The junior officer, faced with the threat of a perjury charge and losing his job entirely, broke down under formal questioning and confessed. He had been paid 20,000 rupees by a man connected to Baldev's construction business to adjust the evidence. The phone records, once fully disclosed, revealed calls between Suresh and Baldev on the night of the murder, calls in which, per additional testimony later gathered from a hired laborer named Chintu who agreed to testify under witness protection, Baldev had ordered his brother to be handled. After a dispute over money, Suresh had allegedly been skimming from the land purchase scheme. Chintu, riddled with guilt for months, testified that he had been paid to stage the crime scene to implicate the Daba fellow who humiliated Suresh in front of everyone. Kamla, the widow Ranveer had protected, finally found the courage to testify as well, once she learned that a judge, a real judge, not the corrupt puppet officials Baldev usually dealt with, was overseeing the case personally. She described the harassment, the threats, and the night Ranveer had intervened, confirming that he had walked her straight home and had shown no sign of anger or violence, only concern for her safety. Piece by piece, the fabricated case against Ranveer Thakur crumbled, revealing underneath it the real, ugly truth. A wealthy contractor who had orchestrated his own brother's murder and then framed an innocent, poor Daba owner to cover his tracks and clear land for a construction project. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the day of the final verdict. Word of the extraordinary story had spread across the district, then the state, and finally national news channels had picked it up. Judge recognizes childhood friend as wrongly accused man in Nagpur murder trial. Meera sat in the front row, Aryan beside her, both dressed in their cleanest clothes, both trembling with a mixture of hope and residual fear after months of uncertainty. Kamla sat a few rows back, having found her courage at last. Even Devendra's elderly father, now walking with a cane but insisting on being present, sat quietly in the gallery, watching his son with quiet pride. Justice Devendra Rai entered the courtroom, and for a moment, before beginning the formal proceedings, his eyes found Ranveer's. A small, silent nod passed between them, not of a judge to the accused, but of one old friend to another, acknowledging the long road that had led them back to each other. This court, Justice Rai began, his voice carrying the full formal weight of the law, has reviewed extensive additional evidence, including forensic reanalysis, phone records, eyewitness testimony, and a confession from a key witness involved in the fabrication of evidence against the accused. Based on this evidence, this court finds that the fingerprint evidence originally submitted was falsified. The phone records establish clear communication between the deceased, Suresh, and his brother Baldev on the night of the murder, contradicting Baldev's earlier statement that he had no contact with his brother that evening. Witness testimony from Chintu Yadav directly implicates Baldev in ordering the murder of his own brother, and subsequently orchestrating the framing of the accused, Ranveer Thakur, to divert suspicion and clear a legal obstacle to a land acquisition scheme. He paused, looking directly at Ranveer. This court finds the accused, Ranveer Thakur, not guilty of all charges. He is to be released immediately, with a formal note in the record reflecting the wrongful nature of his prosecution and detention. The courtroom erupted, not with the usual restrained murmur of legal proceedings, but with genuine, unfiltered emotion. Mira broke into sobs of relief, pulling Aryan into her arms. Journalists scrambled to capture the moment. Kamla wept quietly, relieved that her silence hadn't cost an innocent man his life. Justice Rai continued, his voice firm now, turning toward the back of the courtroom where police officers, following his earlier order, moved to formally place Baldev under arrest. This court further orders the immediate arrest of Baldev Prasad on charges of murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, along with the arrest of all individuals found complicit in the fabrication of evidence in this case, including the falsification of forensic reports. Baldev, his face pale and his composure entirely gone, was led out in handcuffs, his earlier smugness replaced by the same fear he had once inflicted on others. After the courtroom emptied, after the formalities were completed, after Mira and Aryan had embraced Ranveer so tightly, it seemed they might never let go. Justice Devendra Rai stepped down from behind his desk one final time, dismissing the formality of his position, and walked over to his old friend. "You saved my life once," Devendra said, his voice thick, "behind a water tank when I was too weak to save myself. I never got the chance to thank you properly. I looked for you for years, Ranveer. I searched old addresses, asked people from our old school, but you had already moved, and I had no way to trace you. I thought maybe I'd lost that chance forever." Ranveer, still in a daze from the sudden reversal of what had seemed like a certain, cruel fate, could only shake his head slowly. "I never thought about it as saving anyone. I just couldn't watch you get hurt for no reason. That's all it ever was." "That's all it ever needed to be," Devendra said. "You didn't need a reason to be good. That's what made you different from most people I've met since, including some who have stood in front of my bench in robes far more expensive than mine." He looked over at Mira, who was wiping her eyes, and at Aryan, who was staring up at the judge with wide, curious eyes, still trying to process how the man in the black robe had somehow known his father since they were both boys. "Once told me," Devendra continued, kneeling slightly to be at Aryan's eye level, "or rather your father told me a long time ago that he never expected to be more than a laborer. But he was wrong. He was already more than that. He was the kind of man who steps between danger and someone weaker without asking what he'll get in return. That's rarer than any law degree, any title, any robe I've ever worn." He looked back up at Ranveer. "The world needs more men like you, not fewer. Don't ever let anyone, not even a courtroom, not even fear, not even poverty, convince you otherwise." In the months that followed, the story of Ranveer Thakur's wrongful trial and the extraordinary reunion with his childhood friend, now a respected judge, spread far beyond Nagpur. Local journalists who covered the trial pushed for accountability, and the state's Judicial Oversight Committee opened a formal review into how corrupt officers and paid-off lawyers had nearly sent an innocent man to prison, a review that led to broader reforms in how legal aid was assigned to defendants who couldn't afford private representation. Devendra, using his position, quietly ensured that a portion of the compensation Ranveer was legally entitled to for his wrongful imprisonment was expedited rather than left to languish in bureaucratic delay for years, as such cases often did. He never allowed it to appear as favoritism. Every step was handled transparently, through the correct legal channels, precisely because he understood, more than most, the importance of doing things the right way, even when the easy way was right there in front of him. Ranveer used part of the compensation to expand his dhaba into a small but proper restaurant, one that could comfortably support his family without the constant fear of running dry by the end of the month. He hired 2 other men from his old village to work with him, men who, like him, had few opportunities and even fewer people willing to give them a chance. Aryan, who had once flinched at police sirens, began waking up early not out of fear, but excitement. His father had promised to help him study for a scholarship exam, determined that his son would have chances neither he nor Devendra had growing up, except through relentless effort and a little grace from people who chose to remember where they came from. Devendra visited the restaurant every few weeks, sitting at the same corner table, insisting each time on paying full price despite Ranveer's protests, joking that a judge who accepted free meals from a man connected to a case he'd once presided over would set a poor example, though they both knew the real reason was something quieter and simpler than legal ethics. It was 2 old friends, picking up a thread of friendship that circumstance had cut short decades ago, refusing to let it fray again. Years later, when Aryan was old enough to understand the full weight of what had happened to his father, he asked him one evening, as they closed the restaurant together, "Baba, do you think it was luck? That judge uncle happened to be the one who came for your trial that day." Ranveer thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I used to think so, but now I think it wasn't luck that saved me, Beta. It was a promise, made 20 years before I ever needed saving. A promise made under some stars, by a boy who believed that good actions echo forward, even when you can't see where they'll land." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I didn't help Devendra all those years ago because I expected anything back. I helped him because it was right, and because someone weaker than me needed someone stronger to stand beside them for just a moment. That's the only lesson worth passing down to you. Not that kindness guarantees a reward. It doesn't, not always, not for everyone. But that kindness is never wasted, even when you can't see its return. Sometimes it takes 22 years to come back around. Sometimes it never does. But you do it anyway, because it's who you choose to be, not because of what you might get." Aryan nodded slowly, filing the words away in the quiet, absorbing way children do when something important is being said, even if they don't yet fully grasp its weight. Outside, the evening traffic of Nagpur rushed past the small restaurant that had once been a struggling roadside stall, a testament to a man who had lost everything except his integrity, and found, in the most unexpected way, that integrity is sometimes the only inheritance that truly protects you when the world turns against you. And somewhere across the city, in a modest government bungalow reserved for district judges, Devendra Rai sat on his balcony that same evening, looking up at a sky full of stars. The same sky, in some sense, that had once stretched over a village rooftop where 2 boys, one destined for a courtroom and one destined for hardship, had made a promise neither fully understood the weight of at the time. He smiled quietly to himself, raised his cup of tea in a small, private toast to the past, and whispered into the night air, "Thank you, Ranveer, for teaching me, before I ever stepped into a courtroom, what justice is actually supposed to feel like."